Welcome to Wines We Drink, a podcast for wine lovers and learners. I'm Charlotte Norsworthy Varnum, and together with my counterpart Keith Herndon, we'll be exploring a new wine each week. Keith is a lover of wine, and I am a learner of wine, and we hope that you'll continue learning and sipping along with us. Welcome back, everyone, to our summer podcast. It's called Wines We Drink, and that's what we do. We drink some wine, we talk about it. I'm Charlotte Norsworthy Varnum, and I'm joined by my co-host Keith Herndon, a certified wine sommelier.
Yes, Charlotte, I'm so happy to be with you today, as I'm sure our listeners could tell from the crowd sounds a few minutes ago that we're back on location as we close out season 3. Our last 3 episodes are here at our home away from home, the Tapped Athens Wine Tasting Market.
We're so excited to be back in this wonderful wine bar where our friends Todd and Angela Hurt, the Tapped proprietors, always roll out the red carpet for us. And for our listeners today, you found us on our 10th episode of season 3.
Amazing. The summer is rolling along as we've reached double digits in the number of episodes. Another milestone in this, what I think has been a great season for us.
I think you're right. It's been an amazing, great season. We've opened with some wonderful summer wines, and I even got a sherry lesson before we moved into our slate of luscious reds. So if you've missed any of our shows from this past season or from seasons 1 and 2, you'll find them on all major podcast platforms. We also have a complete episode guide at wineswedrink.com, so please check out the website. That is the plugs. Keith, what do you have for us today?
Well, Charlotte, today we'll also be enjoying a lovely red that I think is it's interestingly complex and was somewhat of a mystery until the mid-1990s.
Okay, another wine mystery to unravel. I love it.
Well, I won't keep you in suspense for long. We're headed to Chile, and it's Apalta Valley for an exceptional example of a Carménère. It's just a varietal that's now surging in popularity.
Well, that sounds pretty straightforward. What's the mystery behind this specific varietal?
Well, these vines were first introduced in Chile all the way back in the 1800s, okay? But for centuries, the varietal was misidentified there. It was thought to be Merlot, or at least a clone of Merlot. See, Carménère's ancestral home is the Bordeaux region of France. And in the 1800s, it was often used as a blending grape in Bordeaux wines, right? And as was Merlot. So that's likely how the confusion began. But to me, it's surprising that the misidentification lasted for so long.
So then how did they discover the mistake?
Well, it was in 1994 when a French wine botanist began documenting how these Chilean Merlot vines had fruit that was ripening much later than a typical Merlot. So he surmised that the vines weren't Merlot at all. He was right, right? So thanks to his research and then a lot of follow-on DNA testing, it turned out that the Chilean Merlot was actually Carménère. So the Chilean government and wine regulators there officially recognized Carménère as a Chilean varietal in 1998.
That's pretty incredible. I mean, the old taste buds weren't good enough. It really took some botany research and DNA testing to convince the regulators what was actually in the vineyard.
Yeah, that's right. And even more interesting is that Chile has essentially displaced France as the home of Carménère now. The most recent acreage reports I could find show that less than 100 acres of Carménère are grown in France. But there are about 27,000 acres of this varietal in Chile. And that's a surge from around 17,000 acres as recently as 2006. So you can see what I meant about the popularity of this varietal. They're planting more to meet the demand.
Yeah, it's definitely increased exponentially. I mean, in terms of how that compares, though, total acreage, is that a lot of growth for a single varietal?
Well, I think absolutely. And as I just said, it's a testament to the growing popularity of Carménère on the world stage. But for this growth to occur in such a concentrated area, it's almost a testament to the perfect viticulture marriage.
A perfect marriage. What do you mean?
Well, Carménère is perfectly suited to the climates and soils in Chile. Gene Spaziani wrote about this in the spring issue of the American Wine Society's Wine Journal. He called the grape, quote, noble and demanding, end quote, right? And he wrote about how it needed balanced soils, not too poor, not too fertile. He talked about its need for just the right amount of moisture and just enough sunshine to get it through its longer ripening cycles. Then he eloquently summarized the whole thing this way, quote, Carménère, originally French, but now Chilean at heart, gathers up the affability and warmth of the land and offers it to the world through its ripe fruit, end quote.
Wow, that is certainly a poetic way to think about this grape. It certainly puts me in the mood to drink some Carménère, and I just love the story behind its new adopted heritage. So are we ready to open today's selection then?
Yes, but first let me mention that since we're recording today's episode at Tap Athens Wine Tasting Market, I want everybody to know that I discovered this bottle that we're opening today through a tasting that was held here. And as a special treat for our listeners, we'll be joined later in the show by Katie Schmidt, a wine importer who led the tasting. She's lived in Chile for a time and is going to bring some great insights to us later in the show.
Ooh, okay. Well, let's drink some wine. What are you serving today?
This is a 2020 Carménère from the La Postal Winery. The bottle is a blend of grapes harvested from the Apalta Valley, an exceptional area for this varietal.
And I can see that you've had it decanting for a little while, so now let's pour.
Yeah, so let's see. We'll get you a glass here. Okay.
What a beautiful color that is.
Yes, when it comes to decanting, I like to take the advice of the winemakers when it's available, right? And in this case, the official tasting notes suggested to decant before serving, so I've had it in the decanter for about a half an hour.
Okay, well, and I could kind of preview that deep color that I noticed earlier since it was decanting, and then as you were pouring just now, you can see it's such a purpley red, and it's way more noticeable in the glass. It's rich, and it's almost opaque.
Yes, it's a deep, rich color. I think the official tasting notes describe this color as intense.
Yeah, absolutely. I made a mistake of wearing a white shirt today, so I'll be very careful while sipping because it is intense. It's very vibrant. And, I think I'm ready then to carefully go in for that first smell.
Yes.
Wow.
Well, I'm really interested in what you have to say about those aromas.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly an aromatic wine. Lots of fruit coming through, and I'm definitely getting some berry notes. You could kind of expect that from a color like this, but especially something like blackberry. There's something a little bit sharper to the smell, and I think blackberry is kind of what I'm getting at. I'll say or even like a tart cherry juice.
Oh, that's really good. So give it another sniff. And then go in for those first tastes, and let's see what carries over from the smells to your palate.
Ooh, wow. There's a nice spiciness to this wine that comes through when you're tasting it that I wasn't quite getting on the smell. So I'm going to have another sip and try and put into words what I'm trying to say here.
Yeah, take your time. Let's do a good translation here for our audience, right? For me, there's a real jammy quality to the fruit flavors. I've seen notes describe this like preserves.
Ooh, okay, yeah. I would absolutely agree with that. While the fruit flavors are there, my taste buds seem to zero in more on that spiciness. That's really what I was trying to parse through. And there's some of what I'm going to call just like traditional black pepper. But there's also like a vegetable quality, which may not sound appetizing, but I promise it is. And that one for me is even more noticeable, almost like bell pepper or red pepper.
Those are some great observations about the pepper profile in this wine. It's complex. When I allow this wine to linger on the palate, I love its tannins. It's not overly stringent because I think, it spent some time in oak barrels, help round them out a little bit. That pepper notes come through along with those traditional aging flavors that you get, like vanilla. The winemakers aged this in oak barrels for 12 months before bottling, and then it was all in French oak, and about 15% of that French oak was new. So there's definitely going to be some oaky qualities imparted from that process into the bottle and then into your glass.
Yeah, I mean, that oakiness, especially in the finish, I think is really nice. And I think there's also a nice acidity to this wine. You mentioned some astringency, and that contributes to its strong finish. I think it's not too acidic, but it's really just balanced in a great way.
Yeah, I love how some of the official reviews describe this wine, okay? James Suckling described it as, quote, spicy yet exuberant, end quote. Wine enthusiasts said it's, quote, intense fruit flavors are balanced by refreshing acidity, end quote. And then Wine Spectator called it, quote, fruit-packed, end quote. Yeah.
Yeah, that concentrated nature of it. I'd say we did a pretty good job with our descriptions then.
Right. Well, you did. I'd already read those descriptions before we recorded, right? Before we go any further, though, with this wine, I'd like to explain a little bit more about it, right? In the Chilean regulations, if a bottle is at least 85% of a specific varietal, that's all that has to be listed on the bottle. So this 2020 La Postal is 85% Carménère, and that's its label varietal, right? But the winemaker felt this vintage needed a little taming, right? That's my word for it, taming, right? So they blended in 12% Syrah and 3% Petit Verdot. Now, I believe this blending really works. And that's why I chose to highlight this particular vintage as opposed to some of the others, right? The tannins are softer, and the spiciness might be dialed back just a hair, and that's my taste. For our listeners, though, that might want a less tamed version from La Postal, I'd suggest snagging a bottle of the 2021 vintage. That one is 97% Carménère with just a 3% splash of Merlot added in to do a slight taming.
Right, just a slight smoothing over. I mean, I think it's important for our listeners to understand that, though. A wine sold under the same label and varietal that can differ quite a bit from vintage to vintage, and it's always a really good idea to check out the notes, read the back of the label, really make sure you're getting what you think you're getting, because that sounds like two very different wines. So, okay, now let's talk about our pairing for today's selection with some food.
So once again, let's start with a cheese pairing. In this case, I'll suggest what I call a like-on-like pairing. By that I mean pairing similar qualities, okay? So to complement the pepper notes in our Carménère, remember you talked about some black pepper sensations and also some vegetal qualities like bell pepper and red pepper. All those kind of work together. So let's go with a pepper jack cheese.
Okay.
So I've placed some slices of a nice pepper jack on some crackers for you. So give those a try with some sips of our wine today.
Okay. Oh, wow. That is a wonderful pairing. The pepper jack, as its name says, is quite peppery, but it combines with that flavor in the wine to amplify those pepper sensations in the wine in such a good way. That is just delicious.
Sometimes pairing a like-on-like can be too overpowering because it just serves to amplify each quality, and then you are left with kind of a loudspeaker in your mouth, right? But in this case, I just think it works. So let's move on from the cheese and talk about how this wine is really versatile when pairing with main courses.
Well, that's good to hear. What would you recommend?
One of the pairings suggested in the winery's tasting notes call for a 4-cheese pasta with grated truffles.
Ooh, okay. If
that
you
sounds
have those around.
That sounds wonderful to me, but I also think this would be a perfect companion to a dish I found recommended by Wine Folly, a Cuban-style pork roast that features black peppercorns and garlic cooked in a combination of citrus juices, orange, lemon, and lime. The acidity in this dish and the mild acidity in this wine will work very well together.
Wow. Yeah, that sounds mouth-watering, delicious. But if I'm going to indulge with those pairings, how much would I need to allocate for this wine?
Well, I think this is an exceptional value, once again. The Vivino app lists the average national price at $25, and that is a great price for this quality. The official reviews I mentioned earlier, James Suckling gave this wine a 93 score. Wine Enthusiast gave it a 90. On the Vivino app, it ranks among the top 3% wines in the world.
Wow. Okay. Well, that's another great wine value. And I can't wait to hear more about this wine and winery in the Finnish portion of our program today. I'm really bought in now.
Yes, when we come back from the break, I'll be joined by Katie Schmidt, who works at Winebow, the importer of this wine. She spent quite a bit of time in Chile at this winery and others in the area there, and she'll have some great insights to share with us.
So listeners, please stay with us through our short break. We'll be back in a moment. Meanwhile, I'll be treating myself to a few more sips of this Carménère along with some more bites of this pepper jack cheese. It's a pepper party, folks. We'll be right back. This is the portion of the show we call The Finish, and today Keith is talking with the importer who introduced him to today's Carménère, Katie Schmidt from Winebow. Keith, the mic is yours.
Well, thanks, Charlotte. I really appreciate you kicking this over to the interview. We have with us, as we introduced, a very special guest, Katie Schmidt. Katie works for the importer Winebow and is a certified Winebow professional, I saw on your resume. So if, a lot of our audiences may not be really aware of what a wine importer does. So before we get into the details about talking about today's wine, please give a little background on what a wine importer does and your role in the wine world today.
Yeah, sure. So, as many of us in the wine industry and even outside of the wine industry knows that in the United States, we have what we call our 3-tier system, right? And that was developed post-prohibition for many different reasons. But in that 3-tier system, the wine importer lands at the first tier. So basically, our role is to be the person, the go-between between the producer, say in Chile, for example, and the distributors here in the United States. So we place all the orders, we bring all of the wine in, bring it into the States, and then we essentially sell it to individual distributors throughout the States. My role is a regional manager. So I basically manage Winebow Imports business for the Southeast, for several states throughout the Southeast. So I'm kind of the, contact person for each one of those states when it comes to, our business with any of the wines that we sell to them, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Yeah.
So tier 1, you're the importer. Tier 2 would be the distributor,
Yes.
kind of like the wholesaler in a way. And then tier 3 is the consumer facing aspect of it, whether that's a package store or a grocery store or a restaurant. Is that the way? Okay.
Yep. That's
excellent.
Correct.
Great. So what's your background? How did you get into the wine business? I mean, you just didn't wake up one day and say, I'm a wine importer, right?
No, but I thank goodness every day I wake up and say, no, I'm just kidding. So I started out, as a lot of people in our industry did, in food and beverage. When I was a little kid, I always wanted to be a chef. That was kind of what my dream job was. If you ask 10-year-old me, what did I want to do when I grow up? I wanted to be a pastry chef. And that's mostly because I had a big sweet tooth, but also because food always fascinated me. And so as I got older, I worked for the Ritz-Carlton Hotel Company and had an awesome experience with them, wonderful education with them, not only in food and beverage service, but particularly in wine education. And then from there, I had the opportunity to work for a distributor here in Georgia, for Winebow distribution here in Georgia. And so actually worked for them and covered Athens, the Athens territory, for many, many years with them. And then from there, I had the opportunity to move down to Chile, which was about as important in my career as anything so far. Lived there for about a year, worked for the Cousiño family. They make and own a winery called Cousiño Macul. They are the oldest continually family-owned winery in Chile. So super historic, really lovely family, and had a wonderful experience with them. And so when I moved back to the States, that's what kind of put me on what we call the supplier side or the importer side, where I was working directly for that family as the representative here in the States. What led me to Winebow is that they were our importer. And so after a few years, I was able to take a position with Winebow. So that's kind of the long and short of it, is that, food is my first passion, but what goes better with food than wine? And it was a really easy transition. And the more you get into wine, the more it just kind of blows your mind at how many parts of our world it affects. Not only, do you talk about the science of growing grapes and making wine, but you're talking about history, you're talking about religion, you're talking about, so many different aspects in this world that it kind of, I caught the bug and it's never let go. So
That's fantastic. So
yeah.
let's follow up just a moment about your time in Chile. I mean, that sounds like a really immersive experience. How important was that in the development of your wine career?
Yeah, that was incredible. Like I said, it was about as formative as anything. So, first being able to work in a winery, people think that when you work in a winery, you're out in the field and picking grapes and all that. And luckily, I wasn't part of that team. I was on the inside of the winery making the wine. And by that, I mean, I actually just followed around a bunch of enologists and professionals who tolerated me asking a bunch of questions for a few months. I did that during harvest. So, down in Chile, their harvest starts around the end of February, goes through April. So I did that for a couple of months. That was just incredible because we all read about making wine. We all know the steps. We all know the different techniques that we've read about, but until you're actually there, seeing how the flow of business, the workflow actually happens in a winery, it's hard to really understand. So yeah, like I said, I was lucky enough to get to work harvest for them, work in their winery, be that annoying little voice in all the enologists' ear asking, why do you do that? What does that do? What is that about? All while trying to learn more Spanish than I had when I first started. My Spanish was terrible.
Let's talk for a moment about some specific wines. Charlotte and I really enjoyed the 2020 Carménère that we featured on the show today as our selection. And that was one that you had introduced during the tasting session that we had at TAP. What do you think makes this particular bottle, this particular vintage, a really good example of Carménères that we're getting out of Chile today?
Yeah, so it's, like you said, a really great example of what modern Carmenere looks like from Chile. It is really beautifully ripe, which is, I don't want to say that that's unique, but it's certainly an indicator of a modern produced Carmenere as opposed to ones that you would have found about 20, 30 years ago. They do a little bit of blending in this wine as well. So there's a little bit of Syrah, a little bit of Petit Verdot. Because of that, I think you just get a better made wine. An interesting thing about Carmenere in Chile is that, when it was first, I guess, discovered and or identified as Carmenere in the early 90s, oftentimes it was picked a little bit too early. It was planted in regions that were just a little bit too cool. And you would get these really pyrazine, green bell pepper, jalapeno heavy wines that weren't really balanced. Since then, with lots of research, lots of addition of technology and development, winemakers are learning all of the very best places to plant Carmenere and the best times to pick it. So the Apalta Valley is a great example of an awesome place to plant Carmenere.
When you're talking about these grapes coming from relatively poor soil, well, sometimes grapes like that stress, right? They want to be stressed, and when they stress, then we sometimes get grapes with great character. I think that also works for people, right? We're stressed sometimes, and we overcome those challenges. We can end up as a better person. Well, that certainly applies to grapes.
Yes.
So we were talking about obviously the Carménère and Chile's exceptional Carménères, but you spent some time there. What are some of the other varietals that you think you find either really good or now or are emerging onto the scene from Chile?
Sure. So, I mean, Chile, it's hard to talk about Chilean wine and the history of it without talking about Cabernet Sauvignon, particularly from the Maipo Valley and also from the Colchagua Valley, which is where the Apalta Valley is located, the larger area that it's located within. Cabernet Sauvignon from Chile is a really gorgeous expression, especially some of the top bottlings. But what I'm most passionate about, honestly, if I had to choose, I think the cool climate Syrahs coming out of Chile are incredible. There are a few expressions from, let's see, like Casa Marine. They make a really beautiful one. They're located, I think, up in like San Antonio, up that way, a little bit more closer to the coast. Same with Viña Matatich. They make some really gorgeous, cooler climate Syrahs. So a little different than what you may have had from anywhere in the world, but particularly from Chile in the past. I think that's an interesting emerging varietal, tiny varietal from Chile, of course, in terms of production, but it's a really fun one for people that are passionate about wine and passionate about Chilean wine to try.
Excellent. Well, Katie, I really appreciate your time. This has been a fabulous conversation about wine and your experience in Chile. So what parting piece of advice would you offer to our listeners about their own wine journey? Yours has been such an exceptional wine journey. What do you have from advice for our listeners?
Sure. So 2 pieces of advice: taste everything you get your hands on, no matter where it's from. Even if you don't think that you like a particular varietal, taste it from different regions, from different producers, because you never know. And it's a good education. And then the second thing would be to travel to winemaking regions. I know that's not always easy for people, the cost, the time, all of that, but it's worth it to go and see where these grapes are being grown. It's well worth your time to spend a couple days just in any sort of wine region. You get a much better idea of why the wines in the bottle are the way they are.
Excellent advice. Taste and travel, and that's what we talk about a lot on our podcast. So again, Katie, thanks for your time, and hopefully we'll be seeing you again soon at a Tapped tasting. Thank you.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Thanks.
Thank you.
When someone immerses themselves into a wine experience like Katie did in Chile, you can sense how much knowledge and passion she really gained from it.
Yes, Katie's wine journey certainly adds to my understanding of how people can find so much joy in wine. Yes, wine is a beverage, and we want to make it fun on our show, but we can also appreciate how wine can also be a lifestyle. It's certainly an approach I like to consider about my own wine journey.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and this portion of the show we call The Finish really did not disappoint this week, because now I'm also considering a wine as a lifestyle. More than anything, I'm like, how can I go to Chile and live in that vineyard? I mean, amazing. So before we actually finish today's episode, can you give us a sneak peek into what we'll be drinking next week?
Charlotte, you know how much I love Australian wines, so we're going down under next week for a jazzy treat.
Ooh, that sounds great. And you've never introduced me to an Aussie wine I didn't like, so I'm looking forward to trying another. As we exit today, I'll remind everyone that we recorded today's show at Tapped Athens Wine Tasting Market, and we'll be back here for our last 2 episodes. Thanks to Todd and Angela Hurt, the Tapped proprietors, for their warm hospitality. Until next week, everyone.
Yes, thanks, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Wines We Drink. Listen to our other episodes anywhere you get your podcasts, and be sure to follow us on Twitter @WinesWeDrink and on Instagram @TheWinesWeDrink. Cheers.